In this lecture, I'll be introducing you to the principles of textual criticism. What is textual criticism? Why does it matter? And how can we go about it? Some of you might be wondering, what is textual criticism? I've never heard this word before, and it might not be a word that you use in a sermon or even in conversations with other believers. Well, textual criticism is an academic discipline. It studies the process and history of how the Bible was written and transmitted. That is, how did we get the Bible we have today, and how did the Bible look originally? It notes the differences between manuscripts, and also it explains how the differences came to be. There are multiple goals involved in the process of textual criticism. The first and primary goal is to get back to the original reading of the biblical text. That is, what is the way that the biblical original author wrote the text before its transmission that went on for millennia. And there are secondary goals. One of them involves figuring out why the wording that we have in some manuscript differs. That is, how did these changes came about? And by studying and probing this question, sometime we can find out, or we can realize, that some emendations or changes to the biblical text reflects how the scribes dealt with difficult passages, or perhaps how a different strand of textual tradition reflects the theology of the community. At this point, I bet some of you are wondering, why care about this? Why do this at all? I've preached many times and taught many Bible studies without ever referring to textual criticism or how the manuscript differs. That's true. Probably on an average Sunday, you won't have a sermon only be dedicated on one textual critical issue. That being said, I do believe that Christians and pastors, preachers, should care about textual criticism. That is because Christians should care about what exactly the Bible said. What is original? I used to be part of a church that we would lift out the Bible and says, well, the word in this text is true. Well, if we believe in that, we should care about what portion or what exactly it said, and to also be able to distinguish certain portions that are maybe later additions that may not reflect the original intent or theology of the biblical author. It also helps us to understand the history of the Bible and the scribal community behind it. One thing that I do believe is that the Bible is a communal book, that the Bible is a lived book, that many communities and people have cherished the Bible and have struggled and wrestled with the biblical message. Therefore, to understand even the history of its transmission, how the Bible came to be and how it was passed on by generations after generation, is also a test to the faithfulness of Scripture and how, for people for millennia, has cherished and studied these biblical texts. So, how can we do textual criticism? What's the method? What are the steps? Well, let me simplify for you. Step 1 is to collect all variants. I know some of you are wondering, well, I've never read the Septuagint, I've never read other things, I don't even know where to begin. Well, thankfully, if you have a BHQ or BHS, that is a critical Hebrew Bible, it usually tells you all these variations in the textual apparatus. That is something that's in the bottom of your Bible. Step 2, you're going to evaluate the variants. Once you know how the various biblical manuscripts disagree or have alternate endings or changes, you have to say, well, which one is the best reading? Which one's the faithful one? Which one's the most likely? And step 3, you're going to decide which is the original reading. That is, you're going to come to your own conclusion after studying all the variants, and you come up with your best theological and educated guess. So, what kind of errors are there? When you look at your textual apparatus of the Old Testament or the Masoretic text, what are certain changes that are noted? Well, there are both what I call unintentional and intentional changes. We're going to begin with the unintentional changes. Unintentional changes happen when a scribe accidentally introduces a mistake that might be accidentally omitting words, adding words, or accidentally changing maybe a letter or a phrase. Here's an example of an unintentional addition called dittography, repetition of letter or words. In the Masoretic text, the Hebrew text of Ruth chapter 3 verse 12, you can read here, ve'ata ki, amnam ki, im or em. Here you can see that the word in red is a repetition of the bolded word ki, amnam. When you read this Hebrew text and compare it with the Septuagint, I know the Septuagint is in Greek, and for those who can't read Greek, this is going to be a challenge. But you can actually find the Septuagint translation in what we call the net translation, and this is usually available online. You read that the same passage reads, and that I am truly, this is the word from emena, a near kinsman, goer anoki. You find out that the Septuagint seems to be missing the additional ki em, that a mother, which it just, at this point, if you're reading the Hebrew text and trying to translate what this means, because, truly because a mother, it just doesn't really make sense. And you can actually find out that it doesn't make sense because it must have been an accidental addition by the scribe who repeated these four letters from a word that precedes it. Therefore, based on this, it most likely is an error in that Ruth chapter 3 verse 12 in the Septuagint retains the more original reading. Here's an example of an unintentional omission when a scribe accidentally maybe omits a certain letter. Specifically, this example is called haplography, omitting a letter or word that should be written twice. We see a possible example of this in Genesis chapter 19. In the MT, the Masoretic text, we read, Va tashkena et avihem yayin balayla hu. And they made their father drunk with wine that night. However, if you read the same passage in the Samaritan Pentateuch, it says, Balayla hahu, that night. I understand that it's just one he missing in this instance, but usually hu means him, and if they want to say that night or something like a similar phrase like this, they would say hahu. You can see here that instead of writing the he twice, in the MT, the scribe must have accidentally omitted the first he. Here's another example of an accidental omission, commonly called paraplepsis, which means oversight. This happens when a scribe is copying a manuscript and the I accidentally skips over from one word to another that's very similar. I've done many of these things when I'm typing maybe an email or a paper or copying a quote where there is certain words that are the same or expressions that are similar and your I just accidentally skips over. Usually this divides into two types, homoiarchon, which means similar beginning, versus homoioteleoton, which means similar ending. But because the homoioteleoton is more common, I'll give an example from here. If you open up to Leviticus chapter 15, you actually read these words right in this passage. In what I have bolded in red, it says o hechtim, that is, or when it caused to stop. And if you open up to the Samaritan Pentateuch, you actually see that this verse is longer. And not only that there is an exact same expression of o heftim in this passage, or his flesh be stopped from, his issue. And here we actually find out that most likely what happened is that the Samaritan Pentateuch likely preserves the more original biblical text, which was longer, because it seems likely that the Masoretic text, the scribe, once while he was copying, must have skipped over the I and then skipped over this expression and just went straight to the second time it was referred to, hence accidentally omitting this section that is preserved in the Samaritan Pentateuch. Here's an example when a scribe accidentally makes a change or an alteration. The first example is called homophony, that is similar sounds. That is because in ancient times, some scribal cultures, what happened was there will be someone orally reciting a text, and maybe a scribe is copying, or when a scribe is copying things, they read it out, they read the text in front of them, and while they're copying, they mistranslate a word that sounds the same but is spelled differently. We have an example here from Isaiah chapter 9, both in the NT, in the Masoretic text, that and two different translations is preserved in the KJV and the NIV. Here we read that, and lo higdalta, that is, you will not increase in joy, and this lo, the lamed aleph spelling, is reflected in the KJV, which means to not. However, this translation doesn't really make sense. Therefore, almost all modern English translation, even in the New King James Version, have rejected this spelling and have noted that the lo here must be a scribal error. Instead of lo, lamed aleph, which means to know, to not, they probably, what should have been here is lo, lamed vav, which means to him. This allows further reading as reflected in the NIV, which means you have enlarged the nation and increased their joy. That is, you have enlarged for them, or for these people, chasimcha, that is the joy. Once again, explaining why there was a textual alteration that was made to the Masoretic text. If there are examples of mistakes caused by similar sound, here we're going to see that there is a counterpart to the audible error, and this is visual errors. When a scribe is looking at letters and mistakenly copies down a similar letter. As you can see here, kaf and beit look very similar both in modern block script and ancient block script. Dalet and Resh, the only difference is the small bar that's hanging out. And Chet and Hey, Chet connects all the way. Hey has this tiny space in between. So you can see how this is going to be very common. Let me give you an example. In Genesis 10, what is called the Table of Nations, we have a list of names, or maybe something akin to a genealogy. Here we have a list of name that appears and how these heads of family ends up become the progenitor, or where certain geographical regions derive their name and identity from. And out of the many name, one of the name here that we see is the dodanim. But you see in the Septuagint, it doesn't have a do, but instead a ro, that is a resh. So ro dioi is how the Septuagint translates, which is actually reflected in a later genealogy in 1 Chronicles in chapter 1, almost certainly based on a manuscript evidence of Genesis. Similarly, has a resh instead of a dalet here, and it says ve rodanim. This translation not only has a biblical example and manuscript example, but it makes sense because in these people group that are being explained here, the Rhodians is a known people group and probably derived their name from this ancestor. The last unintentional error or mistake that I would like to introduce here is what we call metathesis, in which a scribe accidentally alters and transposes the position of letters. Here we see an example from Deuteronomy chapter 30, verses 20 to chapter 31, verse 1, in which we read, Vayelek Moshe Vayidaber et. Here we see that, and Moses went and spoke as follows. However, while this text seems to make sense on its own of the sequence of Moses going somewhere and then speaking, Here we actually have a copy from the Dead Sea Scroll, which predates the Masoretic text by hundreds and if not thousands of years. And in this manuscript, the Dead Sea Scroll from Deuteronomy, called 1st QDGRB, I put in red here. It might be a little bit hard for you to read it, but you can actually read this if you know Hebrew block script. It actually has Vayakal Moshe. That means Moses finished. Then Moses goes and speaks. So you can see that the Lamed and Kaf in the Masoretic text must have been transposed. That is, originally it was Kaf first, then Lamed, and somehow in the history transmission, one scribe accidentally flipped these positions of these two letters. And here we can see that instead of Moses going and then speaking, Moses first finishes doing something or speaking something, and then he is ready to start a new teaching or a new speech. In addition to unintentional changes, there are in fact intentional changes made by the scribe. These are relatively rare compared to the unintentional changes. In fact, most differences you're going to be seeing is caused by unintentional changes, and these intentional changes are rather rare, and they're a little bit more obvious and known throughout history. There are four that I'll be introducing here. The first one called Tikne Soferin, emendations of the scribes. That is when a scribe sees a text and decides to intentionally alter the wording. Itere Soferin, omissions of the scribes. When a scribe decides one word may not be right or fit in the context, so the scribe intentionally takes it out. Other places are explanatory glosses, where a scribe may be writing an ancient manuscript would say, well, this wording is different, or maybe this wording is, this expression is rare, so would put a comment, a gloss, in maybe the manuscript, and this ends up accidentally becoming incorporated into the biblical text itself. And at times, euphemism, when there are expressions that might have been offensive to the Jewish community, so the scribe instead decides to introduce a wording that might be a little bit more politically correct or palatable for its community. We know that even English speakers do this all the time. When someone dies, they are not going to say, well, my grandfather died last night. Some people might say, well, someone fell asleep. Or someone is with Jesus in other ways, instead of directly saying the word death. Out of these four examples, because they're rare, I would like to focus on one, specifically the Tikne Soferim. The presence of Tikne Soferim, that is, these intentional changes made by scribes, have been long noted. In fact, the Masoretes themselves identified these and would mark them on the margins, explaining these. Traditionally, there has been 18 Tikne Soferim that have been identified throughout the Old Testament, and, well, if you add more recent identifications, the number proliferates, but traditionally 18. And here you can find that they're both in the Pentateuch, in the former and latter prophets, as well as in the Ketuvim. One example of the Tikne Soferim, that is, the intentional emendation made by the scribe, is found in Habakkuk chapter 1. The NIV reads, Lord, are you not from everlasting? My God, my Holy One, you will never die. But when we read the ESV, it actually reads, are you not from everlasting, O Lord, my God, my Holy One? We shall not die. You note that here there is a different reference. Is it you who will not die, that is the Lord, or is it we, meaning us, people, followers, should not die? When you go back to the Masoretic text, the biblical text itself, it says lo namut. The nun prefix indicate that it is we will not die that's written in the text itself. This is obviously the translation choice that the ESV has followed. But if you open this in the Biblica Hebraica Quinta or Stuttgartensia, you actually see that there is a textual critical note here that says that it seems that this is an example of Tikne Soferim, that maybe the scribe intentionally altered the reading here, because it seems likely that other manuscript evidence will support that this actually should be read that you, with a tav, that you will not die. In fact, if you look at the parallelism here, or the structure and the message of the passage itself, it begins with, Lord, are you not from everlasting? The first statement talks about the everlasting nature of God. Therefore, it's odd to suddenly change from the perspective of the confession of the God's eternality to humans' death or frailty. In fact, probably what makes more sense here, given the structure of the text, is that here the biblical text, or Habakkuk, is confessing that it is, Lord, you not are only everlasting, but you are one who never dies. But you can see how a message, or even the thought of God possibly dying, being offensive for some devout believers or Jewish community or followers of Yahweh during this time. Therefore, the scribes may have introduced here alteration, a change in the text that says, well, instead of saying you will not die, let's talk about we. As people, we all know that people will die, so that's the change that was introduced. So after giving you some examples of textual errors, both intentional and unintentional, made by the scribes, it is important to note that when you're evaluating the differences in these various textual traditions, there are some general rules that should be followed when you make your decision. This is not a coin toss where you says, well, which translation do I like more, or let's have just randomly picking one or the other. Here are some general principles or rules that will help you to make decisions. First of all, consider the issue in its literary context. You saw with the Habakkuk example, the question I said is, well, which reading makes more sense based on that this is Hebrew poetry, which has parallelism, and how does the message fit in the larger whole? Determine if the change is by accident or if it's intentional. And if it's intentional or accident, can we look at similar contexts and say, well, are there similar wording that might have confused the scribe? Are there ways that we can probably explain that this is a change made by the scribe in order to fit other contexts or other passages that might have been familiar to them? These are all questions you want to be asking as you evaluate the evidence. And of course, because there are already reliable commentaries out there, it's always great to go read good, reliable, critical commentaries that will actually make comments on these things. This means that in other commentaries that are more popular or aimed for homiletics or pastoral things, a lot of times these detailed textual critical notes and issues are not dealt with. But if you open up a more critical commentary, whether that be the Anchor Bible, Hermeneia, or the Old Testament Library series, they should usually have notations of almost every textual critical issue of that book. Finally, as you start your exploration into textual criticism, as you read your critical Bible and note all these various textual traditions, there are general rules to follow and guides as to how you can make informed decision as to which might be the original text. Here are 4 rules that I would like to give. First of all, the majority reading with the wide textual type is preferred. That is, maybe some textual traditions or textual mistake is very rare. Maybe it's reflected only in a certain text. For example, maybe only the Samaritan Pentateuch prefers a certain reading, but the Masoretic text, the Septuagint, the Qumran, and all these other biblical traditions or manuscripts support another reading. In this case, it's better to go with the majority reading than the minority reading. Second of all, there's a principle called lectio difficilior. This means the difficult text or reading is preferred. This is because often difficult text may sometimes reflect a more ancient Hebrew grammar or expression. Also, the difficult text is sometimes more reliable because the tendency for people is to simplify things, to explain things, to make things more common. Therefore, if there's a rare form or rare reading, sometimes the harder reading is preferred. Remember, this is just a principle. It's not always the case, but let it guide you. The third one is called lectio brevior. That is, the shorter reading is preferred. Again, remember, this is a principle. This is not always the case. Because, of course, sometimes we can explain that the longer text might be preferred because of accidental omissions that might have happened. That being said, usually human tendency is to explain things. There might have been a difficult reading in a text, maybe a text expression that became ancient. Therefore, a later scribe might have added in the margin or something inside saying like, well, this means XYZ. In the long run, sometimes these commentaries or notes that scribes made end up accidentally being incorporated in the biblical text itself. Therefore, generally speaking, the shorter reading is preferred. Finally, the reading that explains other reading is preferred. Here, you want to make sure that you're not only defending why something is the original, but you also want to make sure to explain why the other readings is inferior or how these errors came about. This will help you make decision as to how one reading is the more ancient and original reading versus how other ones is clearly an addition, maybe a mistake, or some other ways in which a textual corruption was introduced into the biblical manuscript. For those who would like to read more about textual criticism, want to know a little bit more, have some help, here are 3 recommended resources for you. Out of these 3, the shortest one is the one by Kyle McCarter on the right, Textual Criticism, Recovering the Text of the Hebrew Bible. I think this one is great because it's done by a top-notch scholar in the field, and also there are rich examples. The second one that's maybe more user-friendly is Old Testament Textual Criticism, A Practical Introduction by Ellis Brotzman and Eric Tilley. Eric Tilley was a former professor of mine and now a dear friend. And this is a book, if I were teaching a class that had to do a lot on textual criticism, this would definitely be my introductory textbook I would use. Finally, the third book, Emmanuel Tov's Textual Criticism of the Hebrew Bible. This is the largest one, and it is written by Emmanuel Tov, who is the authority of textual criticism in the entire world. This one is extensive, exhaustive, and it has a lot more detail, and it wouldn't be user-friendly. But it probably is the best resources if you're going to publish on something, write a paper on a certain topic. This would be the one to go to.